today, Minister. Can I just begin, if you don't mind, just clearing up something which arose from our trip, just to get it out of the way? Would you expect, Minister, if there was a visiting delegation of members of Parliament to the House of Commons, for the delegation to be videoed without their knowledge or consent?
If someone was visiting the House of Commons?
Yes.
Certainly not. I would think that'd be very unusual.
Or for it to be put onto Instagram and indeed briefed to, let's say, the Daily Telegraph in disparaging terms.
I'm not familiar with the details, but clearly if someone was visiting the House of Commons, we'd want to show them
And it would be
courtesy.
particularly bad, wouldn't it, if it was the Deputy Foreign Minister of Israel who would be videoed in the UK and for disparaging comments to be made about her evidence or her private meeting that she'd had, let's say, with us. Because the opposite has just happened to us. And a video of us at the Knesset meeting the Deputy Foreign Minister has been posted on Instagram. We understand that, certainly we had no knowledge that it was being videoed and assumed, of course, that it would never happen. And I have to say, I've just found out about it. And to say that I'm cross might be an understatement. There were many things said in the Knesset by many members of the Knesset that we found quite provocative and indeed, if I'm really honest, quite insulting. And the attitude of some of the members of the Knesset were remarkably rude. And we did our utmost to keep decorum at all times and to remain polite and restrained. But I do think this takes it to another level. And I would ask the Foreign Office to investigate this, please, and to find out why this has happened, who made the decision, and to ask them to take it down and to apologise.
Chair, thank you for bringing it to my attention. It's obviously the first I've heard about it. I'll look into it and come back to the committee.
Thank you very much. Right, having got that off my chest. We have a series of questions, and I wondered if it was all right if the bulk of our questions are going to be about Israel and Palestine, but we would like, if we have time, to also ask you a few questions, perhaps at the end, on Syria and on Iran. I wondered if I could kick off with some sort of general political questions. In your view, why is Israel refusing to move on to stage 2 of the ceasefire deal?
Well, Chair, I don't want to seem evasive, but
Yes.
it's clear that at this very moment there are detailed talks between various parties in relation to Phase 2, and I wouldn't want to speculate on how those talks are going. Our position is clear. We want to get through all 3 phases of the ceasefire. We want to bring this conflict in Gaza, which has had such terrible consequences both for Israelis and Palestinians, to an end. So we do want to see a move into Phase 2. I'm not really in a position to be able to speculate on the very latest from the Israeli side.
Have you heard? Have there been discussions around the possibility that it is because Netanyahu needs to keep his government going until the end of March, when he's going to have a budget before the Knesset, and in order to keep the government going, he has to pass that budget? And obviously the concern would be, if they move to stage 2, that there would be individuals within the government who might withdraw their support. So the best thing for him to do is to keep things going until then and get his budget passed.
Chair, for reasons you understand, I wouldn't want to be drawn into providing too much commentary about internal Israeli politics. I recognise for the Israeli side that Phase 2 is complicated and difficult, and you can see from the public statements of various different Israeli ministers that there clearly is a range of views within the coalition government about Phase 2. All I can say is that the UK's position is that we should be moving to Phase 2. We have a ceasefire deal on the table. We want to get through all 3 phases of it.
Okay, so can I ask you perhaps then, rather than speculation, maybe if I ask you a factual question. Do we know whether the Americans really have agreed to an extension of Part 1 of the ceasefire until the end of Passover? Have we, the British, seen that agreement?
I'm sorry to be tricky about it, but the Americans are literally there right now having these talks, and they are, I think, you can see both from the language from their hostage envoy and from their Middle East envoy that there's clearly quite a lot going on at the moment. So I don't think I can tell you concretely where they've got to in the very latest in the talks.
No, I understand that, but there's a there was a deal, there was a ceasefire deal, and by now we're supposed to be in part 2. And part 2 has obligations on the Israelis to withdraw forces and to work towards a permanent solution. And that has stuttered to a halt. But Netanyahu at least is saying that he is extending part 1 unilaterally because the Americans have agreed that that's what he should do. Now, as a party with interest, as a country with interest in the region, have we seen such an amendment to the ceasefire agreement?
Well, as you say, that we're behind where we should be according to the original agreement. We should be in phase 2 rather than phase 1, and fighting hasn't resumed. So there has de facto been an extension of phase 1. The precise terms of what an extension to phase 1 might look like, I think, has not been determined or decided. So there clearly are hostages that were envisaged originally to be released in phase 2, not least Avinatan Or, who has a British mother who I saw recently. So we watch very carefully. We are interested parties. We want to reach a stage where Avinatan and indeed all the other hostages are released. Of course we do. And if that could be done before phase 2, we would be only too delighted. That I probably can't provide, I'm afraid, detailed commentary on whether or not an agreement has been made to bring the hostage releases forward into phase 1, or whether or not there's a wait to get into phase 2. I think this is some of what is under discussion at this moment.
So if the Americans have agreed to extend phase 1, we haven't been told about that?
Well, as I say, practically we are in an extension of phase 1. The conflict hasn't restarted, and we're clearly not in phase 2, so we're still in phase 1.
What's the purpose of the conference in June? There's a conference, isn't there, that the French and the Saudi Arabians are going to be holding. Could you help us with what the purpose of that is? Is it that the French are considering recognising Palestine and announcing that in June?
So I think the purpose of the June conference from the Saudis and the French is to try and advance a two-state solution. I think it's still being considered by the French and the Saudis how you might approach that conference. We support the conference and we'll be looking to play our full part, but I couldn't tell you what's on the agenda yet because that's for the French and the Saudis, I think.
Could this be a moment when a coalition of nations, the French and the British, the Australians, various other nations, come together as Western nations and recognise the Palestinian state and perhaps start engaging properly with the Arab League's initiative on the rebuilding of Gaza?
So we are engaging properly on the Arab initiative. We've put out a statement with the French and Germans welcoming the Arab proposal. I've been engaged quite closely with my Arab counterparts in its development. We think it is a plan with real merits, and we think it is a good starting point for what might come next. And so we welcome it. We're engaged in it. I've spoken to my Jordanian, my Egyptian, many colleagues about this plan, which we think has got real strength and is a good place to start.
But in order for the West to show good faith and real commitment to the Arab League plans, do you agree that it would be, now might be the time for us to be recognising Palestine along with a series of other nations so that we can come to the table, with good faith and join the Arab League in pushing for a rebuilding of Gaza and the development of a Palestinian state?
So, Chair, we support a Palestinian state. We want to be in a position to recognise it as the inalienable right of the Palestinian people. I read the transcript of your session with my predecessor, who described the many dilemmas, I thought, quite well about recognition, how the timing would work. As is obvious even from just our opening exchanges, this is an incredibly delicate moment. We desperately want to play our full role in getting Israel and Palestine back on the path towards a two-state solution, which clearly inevitably involves the recognition of a Palestinian state. That is the second state. And we want to play our role in that. The diplomacy
and the developments in the region are incredibly sensitive. So I'm not in a position to make a further announcement this morning about the timing or the method by which we might end up recognising a Palestinian state, only that it continues to be our hope, it continues to be our commitment. We want to do so in a way where we will end up with a real functioning Palestinian state.
Well, I think you're going to be asked more questions about this. I'm just doing these as a sort of opening questions. But I just want to say that it has been our experience that any conversation that we have with any representative of Arab nations always begins with, and when are you going to represent? When are you going to recognise Palestine? It's like a kind of, do you mean this or don't you? And I just think we just need to pass that on to you, because that has been our experience. All right. Phil, you've got some questions.
Thank you, Chair. I know the government has expressed its concerns at reports that the Israeli government is preventing humanitarian aid being gotten into Gaza. With that in mind, what is the government doing to ensure that the Israeli government complies with the UK's demands to unconditionally and immediately lift restrictions on humanitarian relief into Gaza?
Thanks. So we, as I'm sure you saw, we put out a statement on the 5th of March with our partners, so the French and the Germans. I've put out a statement this morning about the restrictions of electricity into Gaza. We follow these issues incredibly closely. We have had staff on the ground. I myself have been to see the restrictions of the aid coming in from the Sinai side into Gaza. I need to be straightforward about the fact that we have been calling for this for some time. There have been moments where progress has been made. So in the early phases of the ceasefire until quite recently, there was a very notable uptick in the amount of aid going into Gaza. Is that enough? No, it is not enough. And indeed, the kind of aid that went in was still subject to restrictions, particularly around items that could be dual use. And the consequence of those restrictions is very significant on the people of Gaza, because much of what was restricted was the kind of shelter required to try and make, as the temperature has dropped, life more habitable in Gaza. So there is no neat and easy answer to this. We, as you say, have been calling repeatedly for a lifting of restrictions, which has not happened. And as I say, we've made a statement about the latest further restrictions from the Israelis. We will continue to work on this with our partners. We'll continue to talk to the Israeli government about this, and we won't stop until we see the progress that we need to see in terms of aid access.
Phil, before you go on, can I just, for the sake of people watching, and we use these terms dual use, and we all know what that means, but it may be for the public, it needs to be explained why the Israelis would be restricting certain goods going in, because they say it's for dual use. I wonder, sorry to interrupt, but I wonder if you might explain that, and perhaps give us some of the more extreme examples of when things have been refused because they are said to be used for dual use.
Forgive me, Chair, and please do correct me if I'm
sorry to interrupt.
Becoming too jargony. So dual use is a term that tends to mean items that could be used both for military and civilian purposes. And in this context, that is being used, for example, to restrict tents going in, because the claim is that the poles could be used as weaponry. There's been restrictions of sleeping bags because they're said to be in camouflage colours. There's been restrictions on water purification units because there's some fear that they could be used for some other purpose. The nature of the dual-use restrictions that Israel has imposed have been so far-reaching as to make again, some other jargon, I'm afraid, what the aid community would call winterization, i.e. providing the aid required to help people respond to the colder conditions of winter, very, very difficult indeed. And it was a question that was very much on our minds as winter came in Gaza, and it was an issue on which we made limited progress, I'm afraid, with the Israeli government.
Thank you. Rifle.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, are you able to confirm that it has been impressed upon the Israeli government that they have an obligation under international humanitarian law to allow the free and unimpeded access of aid to Gaza?
I can, yeah.
Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you, Chair. Last September, the Foreign Secretary assessed that overall, Israel is not committed to compliance with international humanitarian law in Gaza. And that led to the partial suspension of arms exports. But why did it not lead to a full suspension of arms exports?
So I think it's really important when we talk about the arms to first start with context, which is this is a small amount of arms compared to the overall arms that the IDF has. And then let's talk specifically about what has been suspended and what has not. the assessment that we made was that there was a serious risk of breaches of IHL, and so we made restrictions with one caveat, which I will come to. The restrictions we made were for the permission to sell weapons which could be used offensively in the conduct of hostilities, which could pose a risk of a breach of IHL. So what are the things that are not included? It includes the things which aren't for the use in hostilities. So there are dual-use items, like, for example, food processing chemicals, which we satisfied ourselves were not for use in these purposes. There were things like components for air defences, which were clearly not being used in relation to the activities in Gaza. So I've seen some commentary about the numbers. There is quite a large number of things where a licence is still in issue, which would be easy to draw the conclusion that means we're still selling arms. Lots and lots of this stuff is dual-use stuff where we have to satisfy ourselves that it's not arms. There has to be a licence because they could be used in other contexts, but that in this context we're confident.
Perhaps then we could talk about the F-35 specifically.
Yeah, which I was coming to. So we did make a specific carve-out for F-35s because to do so was in the interest of international peace and security. The F-35 programme is a very complex, multi-nation fighter jet, as you know. We provide components to it. We provide components under an agreement to a global spares pool. We could not, where those components are being sold directly to Israel, those licenses were suspended. Where those components are being supplied to the global pool, we could not suspend those licenses without imperiling the overall F-35 supply chain, which, as I'm sure members of this committee in particular would understand, would have significant far-reaching ramifications given the role of F-35s right across our allies and indeed in our own region of Europe.
So, Minister, you talk about introducing this test of international peace and security, this so-called balancing test. How is that consistent with the UN Arms Trade Treaty?
I hope you'll understand, which I won't point to the exact part of the treaties, but there is provision for international peace and security, and that's, this has been looked at in great detail, as you'd expect, by legal advisors right across government, and we were satisfied that that was consistent with our international legal commitments.
I just ask you though, Holland produces some spare parts for the F-35s as well, don't they? And there's recently been a challenge in the courts saying that they shouldn't be supplying those parts for F-35s because the F-35s could be used in Israel. And given that the way that the Israelis were using F-35s, it could in turn be used for breaches of international humanitarian law. And so the courts in Holland have said that actually they can stop selling those parts or label them as not for use in Israel. And that has been the Dutch position. So if it's the Dutch position, why can't it be the British position?
As in Holland, this is going to be tested by judicial review in the Al Haq case, so I imagine that some of these arguments will be tested by courts, but it's the position of the British government.
You're waiting to the courts in May, and then we'll find out.
No, to be clear, Chair, we're confident in our position, but there is going to be, like in Holland, there will be a court case here and they'll come to a finding.
We've just heard about the government position, the statement that you put out this morning, Minister, around breaches of international humanitarian law. If this is a balancing exercise between IHL on the one hand and the serious prejudice to international peace and security on the other, then what thought has been given actually to the fact that when we see an acceleration in breaches of international humanitarian law, that we might then up the pressure on arms exports through this carve-out for the F-35?
So I wouldn't describe the balancing test as being one which balances IHL against international peace and security. IHL provides for, in applying the law, allows for decision makers to consider the balance between international peace and security and some of the other provisions of international humanitarian law. So I wouldn't want to quite accept your framing that it's IHL on one side and international peace and security in the other. IHL considers questions of international peace and security. If the question is, will we in the face of further concerns, take actions on the F-35. I would just restate our position. We believe